All right, this is part 6 of reading through Robert Temple's A New Science of Heaven. And I definitely need to give a bigger, more in-depth disclaimer for this chapter at the very least than I have previously. This is for educational purposes only. This is not for any kind of monetary gain on my part. This is the views of the author do not necessarily reflect any of my personal views. I'm just reading through this and giving commentary where I see fit. And the most important part is that I'm not giving out any kind of medical advice. I'm not soliciting any kind of medical advice. I'm not seeking to disseminate any kind of medical information. I'm only reading what Robert Temple has written in his book and giving commentary on what is read. So hopefully with that out of the way, we can get into chapter 13, and it'll most likely become apparent pretty quickly why I'm giving this longer disclaimer. So let's get into the text. Chapter 13, The Mysterious Case of the Dirty Gas. Our bodies are so covered with bacteria that there are 10 million bacteria to be found on every square centimeter of our skin. Fortunately, most of them are friendly, and we thought maybe they'd stop there, our skin being presumed by the to be the boundary of our bodies. But then we found out that things are not as simple as that. In late September 2015, a flurry of news reports appeared in the media about an article that had been published in a scientific journal by Dr. James F. Meadow, an American microbiologist then doing postdoc work at the University of Oregon, where his PhD was in ecology and environmental sciences. He has now become the lead data scientist at the law firm Dillon Harrison's biotechnology service, Phylagin, Phylagin, something like that, in San Francisco's Bay Area. In his article, Meadow reported the results of experiments he carried out with a group of people concerning the bacteria that he knew covered all human bodies. What he discovered was that the bacteria formed unique clouds, quote unquote, surrounding the bodies. His scientific report on his findings was published in the online journal Peer J on September 22nd of 2015 by him and 6 colleagues. The amazing findings revealed that people can be uniquely identified from their bacterial clouds, quote unquote, which are equivalent to fingerprints or iris scans. Everybody is surrounded by a cloud consisting of millions of bacteria. The exact sizes of these clouds have not yet been measured, but the clouds appear to extend for several feet beyond the body in all directions. When we walk around, therefore, we are really clouds of bacteria with a hard core called a physical body. As for the body itself, the cells within it and supposedly constituting, quote unquote, it are outnumbered by the microbiological entities, bacteria, fungi, and viruses living on it and in it by 10 to 1. What this means is that only 10% of the cellular components of ourselves are really what we think of as us, and 90% is a cloud of microscopic parasites that follows us around. However, most of that 90% used to be us and was ejected. So if you follow the logic, though, what this means is that 10% of us is currently us, 90% was us in the past, and thus we are, in a sense, made up of 90% past and only 10% present. Never in the course of human history has proof been so forthcoming that people really do come with baggage. Sad trombone. According to Meadow and his team, humans emit 10 million particles per hour, which means that we emit 240 million particles per day into the air around us. This is some wild stuff, bro. I can't, like, you can't even see it for the most part. Upon learning this, it did not take me long to figure out that the sedentary lives most of us live today, compared to the lives of our ancestors who spent so much time outdoors, having their bacterial clouds being buffeted and continually blown away by the winds and breezes, obviously means that the as my vent turns on and blows air on me. Isn't that funny? Uh, obviously, winds and breezes obviously means that the concentrations of our personal bacterial residues are much greater than those of our ancestors. If our houses are well insulated and have no breezes or airflows, as older houses with open chimneys always had, then we are living daily in incredibly dense concentrations of bacteria, fungi, spores, and viruses. Isn't it kind of ironic that we try to live sterile lives and it almost seems like we're doing actually doing the opposite. We're actually building up bacteria in our houses because we're trying to keep a closed system and all that. I mean, for obvious reasons, but at the same time, we still get to deal with stuff like this, I suppose. In Meadows' studies of microbial clouds, he specified that the particles in those clouds included resuspended dust, quote unquote, and emission from clothing, quote unquote. So in order to eliminate clothing dust from his experiments as a variable, he had all his subjects wear the same clothes. The billions of microbes we emit may be harmless to ourselves, but not necessarily harmless to people visiting us, for they have their own clouds, which are not necessarily compatible with our clouds, and they may be vulnerable to the highly intensified microbial concentrations of our excessively insulated home environments. The interactions of different people's bacterial clouds have not even begun to be studied, and neither is there yet a science of bacterial habitats for bacterial clouds. Although microbiology is constantly producing studies of bacterial colonies on and within humans and on our cell phones, our computer keyboards, our doorknobs, and our TV remote controls. Getting nervous? You ought to be. The Divic endemic should have brought home to people by now the importance of what during that thing came to be called social distancing, quote unquote. In fact, being 6 feet 2 meters apart from each other in order to avoid contamination of one another is a confirmation that forbidding our surrounding microbial clouds to touch can prevent us from getting infectious viruses. Mm, I mean, yes, but at the same time, you know, we're not going to get into that. The irony is that none of the medical authorities who recommended this social distancing appeared to be aware of the existence of our microbial clouds. They instinctively, quote unquote, knew that we must be 6 feet apart and justified this by speaking of airborne droplets, and just because it seemed sensible, quote unquote. It is time they learned the full facts, which provide a sounder justification for their instinctive policies. The good news is that they pursued a sound policy in this regard anyway. Masks, however, make little difference to our microbial clouds and are pretty useless except in intensive care wards because the viruses are 1,000 times smaller than the smallest holes in the masks worn by the public during that thing. Um, Intensive care masks work. The ones made available to the public don't. Well, isn't that just dandy? Rather than speaking of bacterial clouds, quote unquote, we should more probably speak of microbial. Did I say bacteria? I meant to say bacterial. Microbial clouds, which include all species of entities emitted by our bodies at every moment of the day and night, and include fungi and viruses. And there is a close connection between these microbial clouds and dust, for a great deal of household dust comes from tiny bits of shed human skin, all of which carry bacteria on them, and those bacteria are carried off the body and then leave the skin flakes and float up into our microbial clouds and join in the merriment of quote being microbes together end quote. During the microbial clouds and dusty plasma are analogous in many ways as both are made of invisible and microscopic particles. And later in this chapter and the next, I will be examining the work done on what are called our bioplasma bodies, quote unquote, which are invisible and which surround us just as the microbial clouds do. The concept of bioplasma bodies suggests that we are jointly constructed of physical bodies and bioplasma bodies, which operate in sync. The further suggestion is that when we die, quote unquote, because our physical bodies has worn out or been damaged beyond repair, our bioplasma body may detach from our physical body and abandon it to death, quote unquote. We might be we might be said to continue to exist as bioplasmic beings made of non-atomic matter or plasma. On this way of looking at it, the soul, quote unquote, is thus material, but in a different and more rarefied sense than was the physical body. This leads to the concept of bioplasma beings existing without physical bodies, quote unquote, and I suggest that this is what is often referred to as the other world, quote unquote. Traditionally, it has been called the spiritual world, quote unquote, upon the assumption that it must be wholly immaterial. It was assumed that body and spirit were entirely separate, one being material, quote unquote, and one being entirely non material. I touched on this earlier, and it is what I regard as the prime fallacy of our Western civilization. As previously explained, it is not a fallacy that was ever traditionally adopted by the Chinese. But we must return to our discussion of the microbial clouds. What I want to raise as a question now is this. Are the microbes in the clouds themselves charged? As we will see, as we proceed, there are many researchers who insist that we have invisible counterpart bodies made of plasma, bioplasma, that surround us and extend several feet from us. I guess this is what people. So how does this relate to the fact that it has suddenly been discovered that there are invisible microbial clouds surrounding us? I mean, this might be what people refer to as their aura bodies. I don't know. That might be different. Might not be exactly the same thing. That would be pseudoscience slash woo woo. I guess most people would call it. But I don't know. We'll just have to see. Could and should we call our microbial clouds our extended bodies? And could our bioplasma bodies be continually interacting with our microbial extended bodies clouds? Or could they even be the same, with the microbes taking the place of the charged dust grains that one finds throughout space, for example, in dusty plasmas? And since all of those hundreds of millions of microbes that surround each and every one of us are alive, how can they possibly be coordinated by a plasma body that charges and energizes and forms them? Even if the microbes themselves are not charged, there is sufficient dust accompanying the microbes within the clouds to make it reasonable to say that we are all perhaps surrounded by charged microbial clouds, if only on the basis of the accompanying charged dust that is within them. As for the effect of charge upon bacteria and viruses, I know of no experimental investigation of this that has ever been undertaken. Maybe they'll start experimenting on that. Maybe they already have and it's been classified, so to speak. Who knows? In a paper that is in preparation at the time of writing, I call for such experiments to be done. Things to be investigated include this question: if a virus is positively charged, does it act in one way, and if negatively charged, in another? We do not even have the answers to questions as fundamental as that. We have been through an entire thing without knowing whether we could have intervened against the Divic V by the use of electric charge or magnetic fields. That is a shocking dereliction by the worldwide medical profession. My own opinion is that Divic V traveled on the winds in charged viral clouds, quote unquote, protected by sheaths, which explain why outbreaks were able to take place on cargo ships at sea, which had no contact with anyone for 6 weeks. What makes such a viral cloud suddenly dump, quote unquote, may be connected with encountering powerful thunderstorms. The Earth itself is negatively charged, as all lightning experts will tell you. Ordinary rain varies in its charge. High rain is positively charged, while low rain is negatively charged. Most people do not know any of this. Virologists, there's no two L's in there. Virologists should really be given a crash courses on geophysics. I would suggest that most or possibly all bacterial or virus colonies, quote unquote, are unified entities in some way. But that when it comes to microbial clouds, that must be true to a high degree. If we all have invisible microbial clouds and also have invisible bioplasma bodies, quote unquote, and both surround our dense physical bodies and both are approximately the same size, then how could they not interact with one another? Is it possible that the microbes that stream off us at the rate of 10 billion per hour come and become charged by the bioplasma body, quote unquote, become subsumed within it, take on its shape, and then and lend substance to it? I do not see why not. Indeed, it may well be the microbes and dust continually sucked into our bioplasma bodies that enable our bioplasma bodies to function in relation to our physical bodies. When scientists can figure out how to do so, the sizes, shapes, and configurations of our microbial clouds will surely merit close study. In addition, we In addition, we will need to examine the electrical charges, whether positive or negative or both, of the microbes and the accompanying dust within our personal clouds. And most important of all, try to determine whether the clouds have cellular internal structures. For if they do, that means there are insulated pockets within the clouds that can contain microbes and dusts highly varying characteristics. For instance, there could be cloud cells full of positively charged microbes, cloud cells full of negatively charged microbes, cloud cells in which toxins and pathogens are isolated, and charged double layer boundary layers resembling membranes separating the cloud cells from one another. In the event of ill health, such boundary layers might break down, and pathogens that would normally have been safely contained get released. If we could determine such things happening, we would have early warnings of disease. We should also urgently undertake investigations of the effects of aerosol sprays on our microbial clouds. They would, in my opinion, be certain to alter the ultra-weak charge currents in our clouds. But before we can even examine that, we need to know what kind of charge aerosol particles carry. Are they positive or negative? Charge, quote unquote, can be defined as, quote, a quantity of electricity or proticity, end quote. Charged particles, quote unquote, are called particles because they are small, but they are called charged, quote unquote, because they have either a positive charge, like a proton or ion, or a negative charge, like an electron. Positively charged dust particles and grains tend to be larger and slower moving than electrons. A positively charged dust grain can easily have 10,000 or more electrons adhering to its surface, like sperm chasing a single egg and irresistibly attracted to it. Yet no yet no one appears to ever to have thought about the charges that exist on aerosol particles. Particle sprays of perfume or cologne, dust particles from talcum powder, tissue dust when you wipe noses, and antiseptic sprays that fill most restaurants' serving areas as the staff wipe the tables using a technique of reconnaissance by fire, quote unquote, i.e., first spray your way in and then close with the enemy and wipe. If the adjoining customers choke, ignore them. Ignoring all of these sorts of things is a danger to public health. I remember the creation of a new scientific discipline which could be called electromicrobiology. Scientists working in that field should attempt to study the charging of microbes and accompanying dusts. For instance, if you take a microbe and give it a positive charge, what is the difference between that and taking the same microbe and giving it a negative charge? Okay, I had to pause there because I had a phone call. Let's see if we can get back into this. Where was I? Electromicrobiology. Scientists working in that field should attempt to study the charging of microbes and accompanying dusts. Excuse me, a little bit of hiccup. For instance, if you take a microbe and give it a positive charge, what is the difference between that and taking the same microbe and giving it a negative charge? How do groups or colonies of microbes behave when they are A, positively charged, B, negatively charged, and C, both? How do microbes of the same charge relate to each other of the opposite charge? And how do these interactions differ from uncharged interactions? Putting aside the bacterial clouds, what about the human body itself? It is a little known fact that 1/5 of our body weight is made up of bacteria that are inside or on the surface skin of the body. And these are all in addition to the ones in the clouds that are outside the body. The number of bacteria living inside us is so great that our bodies contain 10,000 times more bacterial cells than actual human cells. Sheesh. And as for the surfaces of our bodies, as we have already learned, there are so many bacteria on our skin that approximately 10 million bacteria live on every square centimeter of our skin. They mostly live in the outer layer of the skin, the stratum corneum, which is made up of dead skin cells. Man, I am butchering these words tonight, baby. Let's do this. So the surfaces of our bodies largely consist of dead human cells filled with enormous colonies of live bacterial cells. The total bacterial biomass on the Earth is 1,000 times greater than the total world human biomass. Earth is thus the planet of the bacteria, not the planet of animals and humans. Ruh-roh. Furthermore, the bacteria multiply their numbers so fast that if we completely cleansed a patch of our skin of bacteria, it would take less than 12 hours for them to grow back again into the same numbers. Ooh, baby. And now we also know that in addition to that, we are surrounded by clouds of further bacteria microbes, as I have just described. So what does that make us? Our bodies are largely bacterial support, incubation, and transport vessels. Fortunately, the majority of our quote unquote bacteria are beneficial to us. For otherwise, we would have died out as a species long ago. Take a drink of Gatorade and hopefully not have any hiccups. Not sure what that's about. It is possible that most microbiologists of today do not know enough about plasma to realize that it acts as an excellent conductor of charged currents when there are imbalances of charge in the plasma, or when the plasma has a cellular structure such as we find in the Earth's atmosphere or in dusty plasmas such as the Kordylewski clouds. As we have seen, cellular structure implies the existence of boundary layers, known as double layers, quote unquote, surrounding the cells, and these layers themselves carry currents, often very powerful ones. If the microbial clouds around us are charged by plasma or become part of a plasma cloud, or even generate a plasma cloud through their own charges, then they can potentially carry electric currents, either whether electricity, negatively charged currents, or proticity, positively charged currents. And of course, once you have electric currents, you get magnetic fields. We may thus be surrounded by highly complex ultra weak currents and fields, and the existence of which no one has ever suspected until now, at least not ones involving microbes and dust. What is more, we cannot rule out the possibility that the toxic characters of some microbes will be canceled out or enhanced by charge. Dun dun dun. And if there are electric currents and magnetic fields surrounding us within our charged microbial clouds, these too can have beneficial or harmful effects on us. I am inclined to suspect, however, that the average effects must be helpful because otherwise, how would we have survived throughout the ages? I don't know, you tell me. The electric currents and magnetic fields that would thus occur within our microbial clouds would be what is known as ultra weak, quote unquote. This means they would be extremely hard to detect. Ultra weak, quote unquote, sounds as if such currents and fields would be of negligible effect. However, there is a massive amount of scientific evidence concerning the crucial importance of ultra weak, quote unquote, fields and currents in relation to the human body. Much of the work done in that field is furiously opposed by various corporate interests, especially those of the big power companies, because the studies largely related to what is known as electropollution, quote unquote, a subject which Big Money, quote unquote, wants to hush up because it threatens their financial interests. Well, obviously, they're going to want to keep that shit quiet. Again, this is the words of the author Robert Temple that I'm reading. This is for educational purposes only. I'm just going to get that reminder out there. It is not only that living beneath power lines is dangerous, which is something everyone can readily understand, but also the intense radiation produced by 5G poses great risks to people. However, that is not for discussion at the moment. I mention it here only to point out how overwhelming the evidence is that the human body is ultra sensitive, quote unquote, to the ultra weak, quote unquote, especially to what we will describe later as biophotons, quote unquote. Ooh, baby. And indeed, to any and all forms of electromagnetism. You know, biophotons, a little bit of a sneak peek. Where am I? We must not forget that the body itself is electromagnetic. The relevance of electricity and magnetism to the human body was revealed very dramatically in 1963 when Gerard M. Ball and Richard McPhee made the first scientific detection of a naturally occurring biomagnetic field, quote unquote, in the human body. And they proved the existence of a magnetic field associated with the action of the human heart. The electrical and magnetic aspects of the human heart are now universally accepted, but what is very painful and difficult for scientific and medical experts to accept is this discovery at the time, because it went against the body as a machine, quote unquote, theory, by which everything was supposed to be chemical and mechanical. I mean, that seems kind of dopey because a machine comes with electricity and magnetism. So if it's a machine, then why would that seems very strange that it would be rejected so readily. Seems kind of ironic, actually. Anyways, modern machines use electricity, like I just said, but the body as a machine, quote unquote, theory did not allow for that and was essentially based on models of clocks and 19th century factory machines. Right, that's why they're still thinking back in terms of like the 1850s with the Industrial Revolution. But even there, you still needed electricity, and we just didn't understand magnetic. fields at the time like we do today. Pre-existing fixations, theories rigidly adhered to, ossified notions, and fixed opinions are the great enemies of progress in science. The myth of progress. But scientists are human beings with all the limitations that implies. And here is the magnetic field of the heart. And I guess these arrows, I mean, he's going to explain it in the figure, but that's basically the whole torso. Figure 25, a diagram showing the electrical and magnetic activity of the human heart. The solid lines uh, depict lines of force. Okay, these solid ones going to from right to left, I guess you could say, with directional arrows demonstrating that the heart's magnetic field travels from left to right. Uh, right, the subject's left to right, not ours. Uh, travels from left to right across the human chest. The dotted lines show the electrical current produced. So you got these like different size circles here. The artist has drawn a schematic small electrical battery at the location of the heart to suggest the electromagnetic nature of the heart from Gerard M. Ball and Richard McPhee, 1963. See footnote to this chapter, which is not in this PDF because it's on the website. So it's like sad trombone. I don't think there's a footnote at the end of the chapter. Over the decade that followed, Ball and McPhee's findings, further understanding was gained. And in 1970, David B. Gieselowitz, 1930 to 2020, published a preliminary paper, and then in 1973 wrote a very lengthy technical account of the subject of the magnetic heart and biomagnetism, in which he said, quote, the past decade has seen a dramatic improvement in the ability to measure biomagnetic fields. They are extremely small, but about 1 million times weaker than the Earth's magnetic field. In the case of fields of cardiac origin, and even smaller in the case of fields originating in the brain. Hence, the detection of these fields has been a major experimental challenge. Nevertheless, it has been possible to develop instrumentation so that such fields can be measured almost routinely. We got the brain or the head. Figure 26, the magnetic field around the human head. The magnetic field goes from the left hemisphere to the brain, of the brain around the head and back through the right hemisphere. The lines of force, quote unquote, have been drawn to depict this, with the arrow showing the direction of the field. From Gerard M. Ball and Richard McPhee, 1963. See footnote 4 to this chapter. And we got like a little, even tinier one, it looks like. Uh, Figure 27. A separate magnetic field in the brain to that shown in figure 26 and discovered subsequently. This field is sharply localized in a tiny region of the brain's left hemisphere. A side view with the arrow showing the field direction goes from left to right, as was the case with the field shown in figure 26, and B, Top view, this field is an evoked field created by shooting electric current into a person's finger, from Gerard M. Ball and Richard McPhee, 1963. See footnote 4 to this chapter. Someone's shooting electric current into someone's finger to get this? I don't know what the heck they're doing there. Very weird. These biomagnetic fields are crucial to our bioplasma bodies, quote unquote, as they continuously interact with our physical bodies through the actions of electricity and magnetism. We will return to the revolutionary idea of bioplasma bodies in the chapters that follow. Electromagnetic clouds around us. After I had written the above, Marco Biskov, uh, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, an eminent Swiss writer working in Germany on the frontiers of science, sent me copies of all the articles he had by Freeman W. Cope concerning the, or is it Kopp? I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It might be German or some European country. Concerning the existence of superconductivity, which, as we have seen, occurs when electricity flows without any resistance within organisms, including our bodies. It was originally thought that superconductivity could only happen at a temperature not far above zero. Then it was discovered to be possible at higher and higher temperatures. And then it became common to suggest that it could happen at room temperature. I had come across Cope's early articles in the mid 1970s and wanted to write about them at that time, but my literary agent and all potential publishers were scornful, insisting it was nonsense and that no one would be interested. Even to publish an article about it in a newspaper, and I was doing plenty of science stories for the media in the late 1970s, was impossible. There was a complete wall of steel erected in people's minds against the subject. I will be returning to this later. I only mention it now in order to explain that I asked my friend Marco if he had any articles by Cope, the best known researcher into the subject, which I did not already have. He sent me some, and along with those, he sent me 5 more by Cope on an astounding branch of study of which I had no previous knowledge. Furthermore, they came to my attention shortly after I had finished writing about electrified dust and microbes forming a cloud around the human body. Talk about perfect timing. It is those articles by Cope which I will discuss now. Friedman Widener Cope was in unquestionably one of the greatest pioneers of biochemical research. In 1982, he died rather young, aged only 51 or 52, so that his work was tragically cut short. That seems kind of fishy to me, but I guess I'm a little too conspiratory. As far as I can determine, he spent his entire professional career working for the U.S. Office of Naval Research. Well, there you go. Working for the G-men, which, as we have seen, does all the secret work for the Navy, quote unquote, really shared with the entire American security establishment, and is scientifically by far the most important of the 4 main American defense security agencies. Cope was head of the biochemistry laboratory of the Naval Air Deployment Center in Johnsville near Warminster, Pennsylvania. All of Cope's work was funded in designated grants from the Office of Naval Research, officially acknowledged at the end of each of his articles. Prior to his work on superconductivity, Cope had been engaged in wholly different routine work in the Chemistry Division of the Aerospace Medical Research Department of the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery of the United States Naval Air Department Center, a development center of the U.S. Department of the Navy. He wrote a number of reports, and his report number 5, dated July 2nd, 1970, was declassified at some time subsequent to 1979 so that we can see what he was doing. The title of the report was Activation Energies of Acceleration and Hypoxia Stress. Huh. Hypoxia is a deficiency of oxygen. He was studying the stresses imposed on pilots by rapid acceleration and oxygen deficiency. He concludes that, quote, moderate brain damage, end quote, may result, and points out that, quote, tolerance to acceleration stress is not limited simply by the ability of the nervous tissue to endure hypoxia, but must be dependent upon additional mechanisms, end quote. This shows that he was doing highly important, normal, quote unquote, work concerning the health of naval pilots. But then everything changed. Cope was taken away from his normal research, and instead he remained until his death in Naval Agency's special researcher into everything weird. The Office of Naval Research does not exist simply to figure out how to stop ships from sinking and facilitate communications between submarines. It has a huge remit which covers almost any scientific subject you can imagine, many of those subjects being very far out, quote unquote, indeed, beyond the known fringes of science. The Navy agency even joins with and competes with the Air Force agency to research the atmosphere. We are, of course, unaccountable to, they are, of course, unaccountable to Congress for their budget being secret, quote unquote. And now you can see why we have, like, what, over $1 trillion in military spending? I mean, come on. At least now we do. All their scientists work under the most stringent security rules, have to sign many secrecy agreements, and can only publish what the agency permits them to publish. And yet, out of this secretive milieu, not only did an amazing discovery come, but the people vetting publications actually permitted it to appear in print. I suspect they realized their mistake too late, because it was not necessarily obvious at the time how much they were letting slip, quote unquote, and what the implications would be. I suspect they also must eventually have become nervous of Freeman Cope, who appears to have been an idealistic scientist, and the last thing a security agency wants is an idealist of any kind. It is not easy to summarize briefly what Freeman Cope was proposing in his 5 revolutionary articles, because they cover complex matters with theories of electricity and magnetism, quantum theory, and some unfamiliar concepts of physics not normally discussed. But before I get to that, I must analyze how embarrassing the revelations of Cope really are regarding the naval agency's files. This cannot have occurred to the censors at the time, for nothing explicit is said that could have breached Cope's secrecy agreements. It is only when all 5 articles have been read carefully, if one knows something of the background, that it becomes clear what was really going on and why Cope became involved in this research in the first place. For what had clearly happened was that the naval agency had asked Cope to examine the seized secret papers of Wilhelm Reich and gave his opinion as to whether there was anything in Reich's weird ideas. In other words, he was tasked with an evaluation of one of the stranger collections of scientific files in the agency's possession. What seized files? Wilhelm Reich, 1897 to 1957, was an Austrian psychoanalyst and one of the most brilliant students and proteges of Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939. In 1922, he became director of Freud's outpatient clinic. He began to develop ideas that went beyond Freud's to do with the energy released in human orgasms. Whoo, baby. He began to speak openly of sexual matters and to promote more open sexuality in society. Rutrow. This caused a great deal of alarm in Vienna. He was also passionately anti-fascist, and he fled Austria for America in 1939, as one does at that time. He lived there for the rest of his life. But in America, Reich caused even more alarm because he was speaking openly of orgasms, and everyone knows Americans in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s didn't have any. Reich's main interest in them was their release of a special kind of energy. He called this orgone, quote unquote, energy. Oh no, here we go. And he regarded its release in orgasms as being only one of its many manifestations. It was, in his opinion, a genuine universal life energy. Reich carried out many elaborate researches. I bet he does. He did with that, attempting to find out what this strange and undefined energy really was. He came to believe that most of it appeared to come streaming in from the sun. Black hole sun, won't you come wash away the rain? So he viewed it as part of what came to be known as the solar wind, but he believed it was not light or electrons or protons or ions. It was something else. He did not know what. What else could there be? Dun dun dun. Sad trombone. Reich's theory of orgone energy, quote unquote, was that it was the essential life energy of all living beings, and that the sexual orgasm was a specific form of a general biological phenomenon occurring in all creatures in different forms and for varying purposes, but found in specialized form in human sexuality to do with, quote, an involuntary contraction and expansion of the total plasma system, end quote, resulting in an energy discharge, quote unquote, in which a bit of the orgone energy was released. He believed that orgone energy would occur in the form of tiny particles, which he called bions. Reich had concluded, quote, that every living organism is a membranous structure that contains an amount of orgone in its body fluids. It is organotic, quote unquote. It is an organotic, quote unquote, system. Thus, the term orgone comes from organism, quote unquote, and orgasm, quote unquote, and means an energy found within all organisms and basic to the orgasm reflex. Because he was a protege of Sigmund Freud, Reich emphasized the sexual part of this theory, causing a certain amount of hysteria amongst many people who did not like open discussion of sex at all. Reich had published his book, oh gee dear, Die Funktion des Orgasmus, The Function of the Orgasm, in Vienna as early as 1927, carrying forward Freud's theories of the sexual energy called libido. Reich was not a physicist, and parts of his research were rather amateurish. Despite this, he made some significant and important discoveries, such as he also designed orgone accumulators, quote unquote, to capture and store the orgone energy. At the time, there was no explanation for how they worked, and most people naturally assumed they were a fantasy and that Reich must be a madman or a charlatan or both. But there were some people who knew that Reich had stumbled onto something. It is necessary to give some of the political background to this, as one of the side effects of what happened was to suppress for many decades any public discussions of plasma, especially cosmic plasma and any plasma or electronic functionalities within living systems. In chapter 14, we will see related actions by the same people to suppress the work of the Nobel laureate Albert St. Georgi, who, like Reich, had sought to refuge in America. All these actions were part of the same systematic pattern of persecution intended to prevent public awareness of certain sensitive issues that many immigrant scientists imported into America after the Second World War for defense and security work. It was 1947, the year that the formation of the CIA, and that a campaign to attack and discredit Reich commenced. That was at the same time that uh, those guys, scientists, were being brought to America at the instigation of Allen Dulles. That guy, that freaking guy, who in the 1930s had been employed by the Gestapo's front organization in America, the American subsidiary of IG Farben, famous as the manufacturer of the poison gas that killed those people in those things. This is for educational purposes only. He had also refused to act to save the lives of those people being unalived by those guys, of which he was informed at least as early as 1942. In 1944, Dulles simulated horror at pretending to hear about the H thing for the first time, whereas he had known all about it for at least 2 years, and not only refused to do anything to stop it, but prevented others from acting. The shocking details of Dulles's lies and duplicity in relation to this issue of those people are documented by David Talbot in the of the New York Times in his book The Devil's Chessboard: Allen Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of America's Secret Government, published in 2015. Dulles uh, was a close friend of uh, Mustache Man's banker Hjalmar Schacht. I don't know if that's how you pronounce the name. President of the Reichsbank, who had created a thriving economy in Germany, which enabled H-Man to go to war. Dulles was also a close friend of the American trader Tom McKittrick, who a former New York banker who, in his role as head of the Bank of International Settlements, well, we can't get into the BIS anytime soon. I tell you that. At Basel in Switzerland, very near to Bern, where Dulles was based after November of 1942, treasonously laundered stolen gold from those guys to obtain foreign currencies for them to enable them to buy essential war materials such as the tungsten from Portugal and the oil from the Ploesti oil fields of Romania. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. McKittrick even went so far as to receive many tons of gold from those guys that he knew to have come from the teeth of the other people murdered, unalived in those things. Man, this is rough. Later, Dulles was to defy direct orders from President Truman about bringing those certain type of people in to America in defiance of American law. One can probably attribute Dulles to the origin of the CIA's traditional arrogance, its certainty that it knows best, and its contempt for mere presidents. In other, well, when certain presidents get, unalived, not just the one in 1963, but others as well. We're not getting off on that tangent. In other words, we may probably regard Allen Dulles as the founder of what has become to be called by the name of the secret state. Certainly, the partiality of Dulles for those guys is well established, and authoritarianism seems to have been institutionalized within the CIA, an organization in which love for democracy seems to be in short supply. As Talbot says of Dulles, viewed from the perspective of 1942, quote, he was running his own foreign policy, end quote, from the perspective of today, quote, and from the perspective of today, quote, dead nearly half a century, Dulles's shadow still darkens the land, end quote. Yeah, I believe it. He's been instrumental in a lot of shit. After the war, Project Paperclip and other similar projects with different names got properly organized, and the American securities establishment was being powerfully manipulated by the imported Germans, some of whom went straight into important positions. Many of them went to work for the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force security agencies. The Air Force was formed for the first time in 1947, having previously been a branch of the Army. It was easy to attack Wilhelm Reich, who was a highly eccentric loner. Reich was arrested. His orgone accumulators were hacked to pieces with axes by the FBI men in front of his eyes. Their remains burned, and there were two book burnings of many tons of his published works. This was ironical because Reich's books had been publicly burned by the orders of of Himmler's SS in Austria years before. And now here were the American and now here were the American imported SS men doing it to him again with the aid of their FBI colleagues. Yes, this really happened in the United States. Quote, the land of the free and the home of the brave, end quote. Those men also violently hated Wilhelm Reich for his those people 1993 publication, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, in which Reich was mercilessly in attacking H-Man and those guys. And he hits home with pungent personal observations about H-Man, such as this one, quote, he assures us that only once in his life he did cry when his mother died, end quote. Critical observations about the Führer would have engaged those guys, for H-Man was meant to be the ultimate Superman, the ultimate Ubermensch, sad trombone, capable of feeling and sharing all emotions of his folk. To make things worse for himself, in 1946, Reich's Oregon Institute Press published an English translation of that provocative book, which until then had been available only in German. Though most copies had been destroyed by Himmler, it was effectively a public slap in the face to Allen Dulles and his friends, and to their entire policy of bringing large numbers of those officers to America and putting them into positions of power and influence at the heart of the American security establishment. In fact, in June of 1946, Dulles went further and helped to arrange for the Eastern Europe and Russia wing of those guys' security apparatus to be transferred lock, stock, and barrel under its leader, Lieutenant General Reinhard Gehlen, 1902 to 1979, into a spy organization called the Gehlen Org, maybe pronounced, I don't know, quote unquote, funded by the United States and ostensibly under American control, which was absorbed into the CIA following the CIA's formation in 1947. With all this going on, Wilhelm Reich was considered a very dangerous enemy, lest the American public come to know that those guys now secretly composed the entire eastern wing of America's foreign spy service, not to mention all those guys who were being brought into America to work on American soil in the most secret projects such as mind control and of course in the development of rockets and missiles. Yeah, they always talk about Werner von Braun, but they never mention this stuff. Mind control. Pause. But burning Reich's books was not all. Reich was committed to prison and mysteriously died unalived there not long before he was due to apply for parole and be released. There are suspicions that he was unalived to shut him up. But the most important thing of all which happened was that his most important secret research papers were seized by the FBI and disappeared, quote unquote. And that brings us back to Freeman Cope's 5 articles. This has been a wild ride. I'm reading this for a second time. After studying the articles carefully, reading between the lines of what Cope says, and knowing something of how the weird scientific branches of the security agencies operate, it becomes obvious to me, and it must have been obvious at the time to others, that the FBI had given all of Reich's seized papers to the Office of Naval Research in the 1950s for evaluation and safekeeping. And that is what brought Freeman Cope to his own discoveries, partly based, and as he freely admits, upon Reich's researches. After all, how else would he have known so much about the scientific aspects of Reich's researches, not all of which had ever been made public by Reich? The naval agency must have selected Cope, who worked for them, to do some work on Reich's papers because he himself had recently discovered strange forms of energy within the body, by suggesting that superconductivity took place along the double helix of the DNA molecule and used organic Josephson junctions, quote unquote, named after their discoverer, Brian Josephson, who received the Nobel Prize for Physics for their discovery. These junctions use the weird quantum tunneling effect mentioned earlier in order to control and modify the flow of currents, sometimes in surprising ways. We will return to this subject to discuss them in chapter 14, which is the next chapter, of course. I don't know if I'll be able to get to it in this part. Cope's superior, this is one of the longer chapters. Cope's superiors must have thought him well equipped for having another look at Reich's secret, strange files and papers. I might add that all my attempts to contact former colleagues of Cope to learn more about him have met with total silence, which tells me that these colleagues are bound by secrecy agreements and are terrified to say anything at all. That is the background. That is a crazy freaking background, man. Now for the discoveries. Cope came to the conclusion that each of us is surrounded by yet another invisible cloud. He describes it as a quote, a gas of electromagnetic dipoles, quote unquote, EH dipoles. A dipole is so called because it has two electromagnetic poles, a north pole and a south pole. A dipole may be a molecule or some other object that has both poles. He believes this could he believes this cloud can be detected on rare occasions by sensitive persons who tend to call it an aura, quote unquote. Well, there you go. We got there. Cope stresses that he wished to investigate this by sweeping away mystical theories and tackling the matter purely scientifically. Cope had no knowledge of the microbial clouds, which I have described above, and which would not be discovered until 34 years after his death. Nor was he knowledgeable about microscopic dust, whether charged or uncharged, and nor was he apparently knowledgeable about plasma either, except in the sense that he may have known about Reich's researches into something that seemed a lot like plasma. That means, of course, that he was also not familiar with the prevalence of dust in plasma and all the phenomena associated with that. What he discovered was therefore something entirely extra, though the two phenomena may well be intimately related. He says, quote, "It is proposed that in the universe around us exist a large number of particles, each of which is both an electric and magnetic dipole." End quote. Apart from Wilhelm Reich's unexplained findings, Cope's initial stimulus appears to have come from the work over several decades by Alexander Rothen of the Rockefeller University. Rothen had also been researching a strange phenomenon since 1942. He had been working with proteins and he had discovered that molecules could, in certain circumstances, interact with molecules on the other side, excuse me, on the other side of a layer of fat. Almost seems like quantum entanglement or some shit, which should have been completely impenetrable to them. Proteins tend to be spherical, and he started spreading them on the surface of water and discovered that they more or less collapsed and went flat. Normally, by being flattened, they could not have been expected to be capable of interacting with antibodies of the bloodstream, from the bloodstream. He laid a layer of beef fat, stearite, across them and provide proof that it was impermeable to any kind of direct diffusion of molecules across it. But he then noticed that the flattened proteins were interacting with antibodies laid on top of the fat anyway, with which they could have no conceivable form of direct contact. It must be stressed that, according to conventional thinking, any form of interaction between these molecules other than direct contact was deemed to be impossible. This was when Rothen discovered mysterious action at a distance, quote unquote, previously only observed in the realm of quantum mechanics, operating inside organisms in the everyday realm and having a material effect. Otherwise known as quantum entanglement, there you go. This action at a distance, which Einstein, 1879 to 1955, famously called spooky, quote unquote, is the puzzling way that pairs of particles can seem to interact even if they are separated in space. Indeed, even if they are light years apart. As a result of this astonishing finding, Rothen began an immensely long series of careful experiments, and he was still working to try to solve this mystery in the 1970s. Cope not only drew upon articles published by Rothen between 1971 and 1976, he was also in touch directly with Rothen and received a copy from him of an article that had not yet been published, entitled Influence of Metallic Shields on Presumably Cosmic Radiation. Rothen had discovered that there was something else peculiar going on, and it concerns insufficiently understood electric and magnetic phenomena, and some strange form of cosmic radiation which was also capable of having material effects over large distances. One needs to recall that Wilhelm Reich had also been concerned with some strange form of cosmic radiation. Cope wondered whether what Reich had looked at and what Rothen was looking at might be the same thing. In going back through even older studies, Cope became intrigued by the meticulously documented and lengthy experiments carried out in the mid 19th century by Baron Karl von Reichenbach, whose extremely large book, Researches on Magnetism, Electricity, Heat, Light, had been translated into English and published as long ago as 1850. Reichenbach's work was at one time fairly well known, but it had been regarded as antique and of little relevance for nearly a century. When Cope discovered it, he believed it contained much valuable information. Reichenbach reported that many individuals whom he tested insisted that they could see faint auras around the poles of magnets as well as around people's heads. Well, we know we got that little figure. Not just that, but this one, maybe they could see something like this. I mean, obviously not the arrows, but some kind of aura. Oh man, I lost my page. Should have looked at the page number. Uh, Where was it? Did I go too far? Here it is. Or people's heads. But Reichenbach was led to formulate a concept of what he called odic force, quote unquote, to refer to some unknown energy that was involved. Reichenbach's odic force, quote unquote, seemed to Cope to be similar to Reich's orgone energy, quote unquote. Reichenbach did not, however, discuss the forbidden subject of sex, as sex did not yet exist in 1850, it seems. Cope also discovered that Rothen was moving on from his discovery of weird quantum effects in proteins to building electronic devices that would duplicate them. He can his co- he comments on Rothen's experiments and the type of particles forming the body clouds, suggesting by his findings, quote, Rothen's magnetic electrode experiments seem to require that the type of particle suggested by Rothen, I'm getting hiccups again, uh, be, mag- be a magnetic particle, which suggests the possibility that it is a magnetic H monopole, a particle having a single pole, not two, as with dipoles. However, H monopoles have never, with one controversial exception, been observed to experimentally despite careful searches, end quote. Discouraged at the unlikelihood of single-poled magnetic monopoles, quote unquote, really existing, Cope fell back on the dipoles that I mentioned a moment ago. Any magnetic object will normally have north, quote unquote, and a south, quote unquote, pole, which is to say quote unquote, or two poles, and suggested them instead. Well, since Cope's day, magnetic monopoles have come back, as we are about to see, they are fantastically important and wide-ranging in their implications, and so worth taking the time to understand. The famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist Paul Dirac had predicted the existence of magnetic monopoles in 1931 and published the quantum physics equations that showed it, quote unquote. His arguments are very convincing. In 1948, he published an expanded version of this theory, which has been very ignored, though it has the potential to revolutionize much of contemporary physics. In this paper, he introduces the idea of a quote quantum string, quote unquote. See my extracts from this brilliant paper and my comments of its radical ideas in the footnote. On the 30th of January 2014, Des McMorrow and Steve Bramwell of the London Centre for Nanotechnology announced their proof of the existence of these monopoles. On the 4th of September 2015, scientists at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona in Spain announced that they had all actually produced magnetic monopoles. Then Georges Lochak, president of the Foundation Louis de Broglie in Paris, and the German physicist Harald Stumpf, a former student of Werner Heisenberg, published a remarkable book in 2015 that revives magnetic monopoles and contains a veritable tsunami of horribly complex mathematics, a whole book full of, in fact, to back it up. Indeed, I proofread Georges Lochak's contribution for him to improve the English, as English is only his third language, his first being Russian and his second being French. Steve Bramwell had stated, quote, "We have observed monopole currents analogous to electricity," end quote. He also agrees that it should eventually be possible to harness monopole currents for technology, though that is a long way off. The evidence of the existence of magnetic monopoles keeps piling up, and many physicists are now talking increasingly about magnetic monopole plasmas. This is very important for us because it means that there may be portions of the Kordylewski clouds that are plasmas which are not made of charged particles, but instead of magnetic monopoles. In July of 2019, a paper appeared in Nature reporting experiments that appeared to have confirmed the existence of magnetic monopole plasmas. It referred to numerous other investigators' papers, findings, and theories about this subject. This paper reported the results of investigations with a superconducting device known as the SQUID, SQUID, to investigate whether the noise, quote unquote, that magnetic monopoles would make, according to theory, really exists. They found it and said, quote, "Intriguingly, magnetic monopole flux noise amplified by SQUID is audible to humans," end quote. They say of their findings that they are, quote, "consistent with other studies that imply that di2 tied to HO2 tied to O2. Dysprosium dioxide, titanium dioxide. Di is the rare earth chemical element dysprosium that is never found in nature, but when produced in the lab is known for its high magnetic strength. Ti2 is titanium dioxide, and HO2 is hydrogen superoxide, and O7 is an anion of oxygen and in combination means heptoxide, contain a plasma of emergent magnetic monopoles, end quote. They cite 9 references to other papers from Nature, the Physical Review, and so on. In 2016 paper, they cite discussed both positive and negative magnetic monopoles, which would be the magnetic equivalents of electrons and protons. In other words, there may be a whole other science of plasma taking shape, which verifies the 1979 predictions of Freeman Cope, though he is forgotten. Let us pause briefly to consider why this is so significant. Scientists expect their theories to be symmetrical, and for the most part, symmetries are a good sign that your theory may be on the right lines. The established theory of electromagnetism, called the Maxwell-Heaviside equations, named after the two scientists who formulated them, has a symmetry when it comes to fields. And there are both magnetic fields and electric fields, but there is no symmetry when it comes to currents. There are electric currents, but apparently no magnetic currents. In order to complete the symmetry and for there to be magnetic currents, there would need to be magnetic particles, which, like electrons, the particles of electricity, have a charge operating in a single direction. But all magnetized particles known about operate in equal and opposite directions, which is to say they have two poles, one negative and one positive. Therefore, in standard physics, there is no such thing as a magnetic monopole. The quest to discover them has been called the Holy Grail of physics, because not only would this give symmetry to the theory of electromagnetism, with gravity the most important formative factor in the universe, it would open up a vast new dimension of theoretical physics when it comes to exploring the fields that give our universe the form it has. Pause. Drink of my Gatorade. As for the practical implications and how to harness the power of magnetic monopoles, well, that was what Cope was interested in discovering in his top secret work. And what I will now call a quote from Cope, we must remember that according to the standard scientific symbol protocol, H stands for magnetic and E stands for electric. Also, we must mentally reinsert that monopoles back into Cope's argument and consider them as well as the dipoles he discusses. Also, Cope uses the polite phrase, quote, our unknown something, end quote, to refer to the strange phenomenon, and he has coined a wonderful phrase, magnet auras, quote unquote, to describe the clouds around magnets visible to some people. Cope says, quote, the observation that our unknown something seems to collect near surfaces of magnets, magnet auras, suggests that we may indeed have H dipoles, remembering that H means magnetic. He means magnetic dipole particles, but we can now add also H monopoles, which are pulled into regions of high magnetic field gradient, e.g., regions near magnet surfaces. End quote. In other words, since it is known that Cope's unknown something, quote unquote, accumulates near magnet surfaces, he reasons that the unknown something, quote unquote, must be composed of magnetic particles. He assumes that they would have two poles, north and south. But since he is deaf, magnetic monopoles having been confirmed, we may add that they might just well have only one pole and hence be monopoles, as he had initially hoped. He continues, expanding his comments from magnetic particles to electric ones. Quote, our unknown something seems to also collect near the surface of the human body, human auras. No magnetic field gradients exist there. Gradient, quote unquote, is this paragraph in this paragraph refers to a flow of energy, either magnetic or electrical. However, if our H dipole is also electric E pole, It would collect also at regions of high electric gradients. The human body forms an electric discontinuity with the electric field around the Earth, thus causing large electric gradients uh, near the body's surface. Therefore, E dipoles should collect there. End quote. In other words, since human bodies have electric fields around them, forming bubbles, quote unquote, within the normal electric field on the Earth's surface. See a drawing of a human standing in such an electric field bubble in chapter 17, figure 32 here. Cope's particles would collect there. Cope goes to explain how these new insights mean that Wilhelm Reich's supposedly crazy orgone accumulators, quote unquote, might really have worked. After explaining how a sandwich of dissimilar materials arranged in a certain way, perhaps not unlike the layers in Rothen's original experiments, might be able to trap such particles, he makes this explicit statement, quote, because of this effect, a box made of two layers of dissimilar materials might accumulate and concentrate EH dipoles from a surrounding gas of each EH dipoles, analogous to the experimental observations of Reich. End quote. He adds, quote, Reich seemed to observe accumulation of some sort of solar radiation. Remember, I said earlier that Reich believed his orgone energy was being streamed from the sun to the earth. With physiological activity within bilayer boxes, sheet iron covered by cellulose, we may expect bilayer structures to act as diodes or rectifiers. Both are devices that conduct a current in one direction for EH dipoles. A box constructed from such bilayer sheets might therefore operate as an EH dipole accumulator, which would explain some of the phenomena observed by Reich. End quote. Astonishing. This is an astonishing revelation. Reich was sent to prison for making orgone accumulator boxes of exactly this kind, which he insisted were trapping some unknown solar energy that he named orgone, quote unquote. Here we have Cope 23 years after Reich's death, and obviously entrusted by the American securities establishment with evaluating Reich's research papers, including that Reich's orgone accumulators probably worked after all, and paving the way for these to be understood in terms of magnetic monopoles that have since been shown to exist. Cope is talking about reconstructing the very same boxes that were chopped to pieces with axes in front of Reich's eyes by FBI men outside his house, and their constituent parts thrown into a fire with his books. It is beginning to look as if Wilhelm Reich may have been a 20th century Giordano Bruno. What kind of mad frenzy possessed the FBI to behave like this? As I've already mentioned, Reich's books had previously been burned by Himmler's SS, and then they were burned again by fanatical opponents of his scientific findings and within the American government. At this point, in his account, Cope begins to refer to the work of another brilliant scientist who seriously challenged orthodoxy, Herbert Charles Corbin. In his day job, quote unquote, Corbin was one of the world's leading experts on spinning particles who wrote the definitive book on the subject for that time in 1968, which is so heavily mechanical that you need swamp boots to wade through it. But when left free for his thoughts to roam, Corbin was an astonishingly bold thinker, as we see in a rather visionary article that was published in 1978, from which Cope draws. Cope and Corbin were also in personal touch and exchanged information privately, as Cope makes clear. Anyone who thinks that monopoles and orgone quote unquote energies are way out quote unquote phenomena will perhaps be surprised to hear that the subject of tachyons is even more so. And Corbin seriously uh, investigated tachyons along with a small number of like minded scientists. What are tachyons? They are particles that travel faster than the speed of light, and they are predicted to by relativity theory. What, you may ask? But surely it is a relativity theory that says that nothing can go faster than the speed of light, end quote, quote unquote. Well, not really. But if we get into the speed of light, then this book will become twice as long, and we cannot allow that to happen. A tachyon, like the magnetic monopole, is a particle that exists in theory, but is in practice a very rare bird, which most scientists would probably say does not exist in the real world. Before we get too skeptical, we should remember that the ways physics evolves. It often happens and happened in the case of the Higgs boson, for example, that a particle is shown to exist in theory many years before it is actually verified by experiment. So I will have to ask you to swallow hard and try to take my word for it that tachyons may turn out, as magnetic monopoles have now done, to exist after all, despite a chorus of doubters shouting crazy, quote unquote. And my headset conked out again. A chorus of doubters shouting crazy, quote unquote. The morals to this story is when someone shouts crazy at you, put your fingers on your ears and carry on. Drawing upon discussions with Corbin, Cope was able to expand his theory of clouds of dipoles surrounding the human body and suggest that clouds of EH monopoles might actually be tachyons. This would mean that even the laziest person on Earth, the teenager who sleeps all day, for instance, may at all times be surrounded by a cloud of particles going faster than the speed of light. So when an exasperated mother shouts at her teenage son, quote, "Get out of bed, it's the middle of the afternoon," end quote, he might justifiably call back to her, quote, "I'm completely exhausted because my body cloud has been going faster than light and all night long," end quote, without going into what was going on here? Pythagoras. Uh, where was I? The, at the top of the paragraph, yeah. Without going into all the technical details, fascinating as they are, I shall give some of the conclusions that Cope comes to on the basis of all of this. He and Corbin worked out together that different diffraction patterns, interference patterns of waves that can tell you the frequencies of the waves, diffraction patterns of tachyons could create quote certain resonance interactions and standing wave patterns of interactions between the tachyons and crystals, quote, end quote. Remember what I said earlier about solitons and standing waves? To explain resonance interactions, which can create standing waves, would require too lengthy an account. But when wishing to understand resonance, think of music and harmonious chords as opposed to those that are not. The most harmonious chords are called fifths by musicians and are examples of harmonious resonance. Cope is saying here that if tachyons do exist, their rhythmic interactions would naturally make them resonant with crystalline structures in intimate and interesting ways. This is a wonderful vision and a joy to conceptualize. Critics may say it is highly speculative, but Cope found a way to describe the relationship between crystals and mysterious energies in scientific terms. He found a scientific language for it. Cope goes further. He comes up with mechanisms in the form of quote superconductive regions end quote to explain how these particles might be trapped within the body. Again, superconductivity is when electricity travels without resistance. He also suggests that on the planetary scale, these phenomena could create a standing energy grid, a vast grid system of resonant standing waves of Earth energy, quote unquote. Hmm. He adds as a footnote that this could explain dowsing if we have all these particles inside us, rendering some people hypersensitive to invisible energy fields. In relation to dowsing, returning to the subject of magnetic monopoles, Cope says, quote, my hypothesis is that the long sought magnetic monopoles are all around us and are in the form of delocalized tachyon, faster than light particles clouds, delocalized tachyon clouds, which form periodic wave functions detectable by sensitive quantum mechanical processes in man. The general pattern of reported experimental observations seems to suggest that delocalized clouds, wave functions of tachyon magnetoelectric monopole polymers, substances made up of large molecules, surround all solid and liquid objects, and that these are detectable by sensitive persons trained in dowsing techniques. The detection is presumably by quantum mechanical interactions with living cells. Dirac monopoles exist as large delocalized polymeric clouds, polymeric clouds, or wave functions with spatial periodicities. End quote. I realize that this is very technical language and probably confusing. Yeah, no shit. But what he is saying is that there are these clouds surrounding each and every one of us, and indeed not just us, but, quote, all liquid and solid objects, end quote. Thus, we are all surrounded not only by charged dust and microbes, but by even smaller electromagnetic particles which are whizzing around us constantly faster than the speed of light and causing effects that we not yet have begun to explore or explain. In this connection, I should add that bees and flowers also have an electromagnetic dimension. For scientists at the University of Bristol have proved that bees, when flying around, are positively charged and sense the flowers that are negatively charged, using especially sensitive small hairs on their faces. The pollen that they gather also becomes charged, and then the charged dust is scattered in the air by the bees rustling around inside the flowers. We may thus look upon bees and flowers as engaged in a continuous orgy of charged intercourse with one another, generating and displaying their auras and creating plenty of charged dust in miniature clouds as they do so. Oh, baby. It really is true to say we live in an electromagnetic world and are only beginning to understand how it works. All of us are electric people, full of multiple currents of both negative and negative charge called electricity and positive charge called proticity. Since charged currents always generate magnetic fields, we are also full of multiple magnetic fields. When we say that people sometimes have magnetic personalities, quote unquote, we may be closer to the truth than we thought. And that is the end of chapter 13. Yeah, we'll just have to end it here. That was a long chapter, a crazy chapter too. It's going all over the place. Hopefully. Oh man, Oregon Energy. I still don't know what to think about that. I mean, we definitely need more research on that for that to be taken seriously by anyone for any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, I guess that's it for now.
What the hell was even that?